Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session of Sediment Stories. Today is episode 8, and we will be in conversation with Dr. Priyank Patel from Presidency University, Kolkata. I am Siddharth from Veditum, and I'm joined today by my teammates Eshani, Ria, and Madhapa, who are also there on the call. As a quick introduction, Veditam is an environmental nonprofit transforming the with a mission to transform the environmental governance landscape of India. And we're doing it by three ways. One, by creating evidence at scale. Two, by empowering communities to be able to take action. And three, by creating empathetic environmental leaders for the future. Our work is interdisciplinary. We are looking at environmental and social justice. So everything that we try to do is with the lenses of advancing environmental and social justice. Our focus extends from grassroots innovation and in immersion all the way to policy work and policy implementation as well. The journey for Veditam started when I undertook a walk along the river Ganga in 2016 and 17. And subsequently, through the Moving Upstream program and fellowship, I have been walking along rivers. Our fellows have been walking along rivers. And one of the key things that have gotten highlighted over these thousands of kilometers of walking along rivers in India has been the issue of sand mining. And this constant appearance of the issue of sand mining resulted in us creating a project called India Sand Watch. India Sand Watch is an environmental accountability project with an aim to protect India's rivers from unsustainable and destructive sand mining. At the heart of the project is an open data platform, the link to which will be put in the chat and also in the description of the YouTube video, where various forms of data related to sand mining from across India is documented and is available freely to everyone. You may download this data and use that for analysis as well as action. In the process of doing this work on sand and sediments, we realized that there is not enough understanding on the topic of sediments in India. And we wanted to encourage more people to understand and learn about sediments. Hence, we started a series that we call Sediment Stories, and today's session is a part of Sediment Stories. Uh, in the past 1 year, we've actually Today, we are celebrating 1 year of Sediment Stories with Dr. Priyank's session being the first conversation in year two. And in this 1 year of Sediment Stories, where the conversations explore the journey of sediments right from where they're created to where they're extracted and finally laid. And in this journey, we've conversed with journalists, researchers, activists, and continue to speak with hydrogeologists, administrators, and other people. Our speakers in the first year have been Rahul Singh, who's a journalist, Shishir, Anuja, and Avli, who are researchers and ecologists, Garima, who's a researcher and ecologist, and Kevur Sarda, who's an entrepreneur working on transforming construction and demolition waste into reusable material in construction. My colleagues Yashani and Ria have also published an article on the topic of sediments for India Water Portal. And the conversations that my colleague Madhapa has actually created these slides for us. And the transcripts for these calls, when we analyze them, showed us that these are some of the key words that have emerged again and again across our various talks. Uh, so, of course, sand is at the center of it, but construction and impact and people and rivers have also come forth, along with a sprinkling of ecologically based terms, and which also shows how interconnected sediment is to so many aspects of life. In these talks over the past year, we've had 6 speakers with many participants, 200 plus, so many questions asked, and media articles both directly from the session as well as post session by others. We hope to continue this work, and the series is available to watch on Vedatam's YouTube channel, the link for which will be in the chat. And you can also read more about India Sandwatch and Vedatam on the links on the screen. We'll also put them in the chat for you. Now, back to Sediment Stories and the conversation with Dr. Priyank. Today, I'm happy to invite Dr. Praveen Patel from Presidency University in Kolkata, where he is an assistant professor at the Department of Geography. The course he teaches is mainly centered around the physical aspects of geography, geotectonics, and geomorphology. Rivers, in particular, are of special interest to him. Their behavior, the spatial and temporal changes occurring across river basins, and various aspects of water resource management as well. Uh, of course, there are traditional methods of analyzing landscapes, but he's also recently taken an interest in more modern methods to analyze landscapes and mapping and representation. Uh, Recently, he's also taken an interest towards analyzing the built environment and how societies occupy them both in rural as well as urban areas. Uh, what really interests me also and excites me about the conversation with Priyank is the fact that he sees geography as an important field subject, and there are many field visits that are also part of the conversation, part of the courses that he teaches at the Presidency University. And with this, we'll dive into the conversation with Dr. Priyank. So I wanted to start off with a conversation from having read through many of your papers and through your work is we are talking about sediments, right? And in the description, we talked about the formation of sediments and their extraction. But if we focus for a second on the formation of sediments, what can you tell us about the formation of sediments from various mountain systems?
Right. So, first of all, thank you for inviting, you and your entire team. And we will talk about a number of issues today, I guess. Well, the first one is about the formation of sediments. So as I'll talk, I'll share some slides with all of you. So that these are basically pictures. And these pictures you will find, they are mainly open source or from different research papers. The references are given. So I'll just share some photographs and slides with you to take the conversation ahead. And when you ask me about what are sediments, where they come from, and uh, I felt this is a photograph that we should start off with, because this is a landscape that shows both the present day sediments and the past sediments that are there. So this is a place called Gangoni. It's not very far from here. It's around 3 hours, 3.5 hours from Calcutta in West Midnapur. And this has become a very popular tourist spot. It's marketed as the Grand Canyon of West Bengal, which is not, but still it's a pretty landscape. And we go here very often to study the river over here. The river here is pretty interesting. It's the Shilaboti, and it is one of the most flood prone areas of Bengal. This is the river that causes all the floods in Ghatal. And Ghatal is very famous in Bengal in terms of floods. But also this river is quite remarkable because there was no sediment extraction or let's say sand mining from this river previously. Then it started in a big rate. Then again it stopped. And I'll take you through what has happened to that river also. Along with it, on the side, you can see large gully systems, big channels, big yellow things that are there. These are the sediment deposits, and these are thousands of years old. That's what we think. These are thousands of years old. So this is a landscape that shows sediments both youthful, very old, and this is what makes an entire river landscape, right? Because the sediments are at the heart of the river landscape. Often when people think of rivers, and the approach in our country has been Nadi equals Pani, but then we think that we know that sediments are an equally important part of the river, and along with it, I'll show you how the ecology or the life within the rivers is as important part of rivers itself, right? So first, going into where sediment comes from, first we look at, if we have to understand sediments, we have to look at the scales at which we study river systems. And that becomes very important, because do you want to analyze the entire Ganga basin as one? Do you want to analyze a single stretch of the Ganga at Varanasi, or a little bit of the Hooghly at Calcutta? These will be very different scales. Their sediment generation will be very, very different. The way the water and sediment will interact across a larger space versus within a smaller space, that will be very different. So whenever we undertake any studies, or whenever there are any plans that are to be formulated for looking at sediments and water, we first decide the scale at which we want to work at, whether it's the whole catchment, that is the whole basin, whether it's part of the catchment, that is a landscape, or whether it is a single segment or part of the river reach. And then regarding where sediments come from, we create such diagrams, what we call sediment source regions, where sediments come from. It's done quite simply. We go to where the rivers are, we collect sediments. Sometimes we analyze them, we look at their chemistry, then we look at the chemistry of the rock. So it's basically if the rock has this kind of chemistry and the sediment has this kind of chemistry, so A comes from B, right? So we do those kind of analysis. And then what this shows is this shows a typical sediment budget that we call. A sediment budget is just like you have an annual economic budget, money coming in, money coming out. Sediment budget is pretty much the same. How much sediment is coming into a part of a river, how much sediment is going out of that part of the river. Are there any additions from the side? That is, any landslides bringing in sediments, any bank erosion bringing in sediments? Is any sediment coming out of the river system? For example, if people are dredging the river, if people are sand mining the river, or if there is a flood and some of the sediment gets dumped on the floodplain. So is anything going out of the river system, right? So this is what we call a sediment budget, and that is what hydrologists or sedimentologists basically use to try and understand what is going on in a river reach. Regarding how these sediments are generated, very simply, in mountain areas, mountains uplift. As mountains uplift, there is fluvial incision or river incision. And this cutting down of the mountain creates steep slopes. Along the steep slopes, you will also have water movement that will bring in sediments along the hill slopes. It can be landslides, it can be rockfall directly, or hill slope erosion. And finally, from a single reach, you will have what we call the total load that comes out, or the total sediment that comes out. That has basically three parts: the dissolved load, so what is mixed within the water itself; the suspended load, that is the finer sediments that are within the water column. That is what makes the rivers look yellow or brown. And the bed load, so this is the gravel or the boulders that is rolling along the bottom of the river. And these three things together, that is what makes the entire load that a river carries out. And the factors that affect this, very simply, the factors that affect this are erodibility. Erodibility means how weak is the rock. So if I have sandstone and if I have granites, sandstone will break down faster. If I have shale and if I have, let's say, marble, shale will break down faster. So it is basically depending on the rock strength. And so if the rock strength is weak, ergo more sediment coming out from a certain area. The slope of the land, higher the slopes, higher the river gradients, more stream power, more erosion by the river. Climate is important. It's sometimes it's a bit of a paradox. We think that more rain equals more sediments. I'll show you that's not always the case, because there is a feedback effect also. But usually, with an increasing amount of rainfall, we have increasing amount of sediment generation, and that's pretty important for our country. Why? Because 80% of our rain gets concentrated within 3 months to 4 months. And we see the entire dynamics of our rivers change during June, July, August, September. Nowadays, basically, we are having rainfall all the time. We have even rainfall after Kali Puja. We have rainfall in January, right? The non-traditional months for rain, we are still having rain. But still, the main rain is concentrated from the southwest monsoon on the southern face of the Himalayas. And India presents a very unique landscapes to assess this. Why? Because we have the strongest monsoon in the world, coming and hitting the highest mountain range in the world. And that's why no wonder they generate some of the largest sediment budgets that come out of these mountains. And so we have the largest fan deposits, alluvial fan deposits in the Kosi in Bihar. We have the largest delta in the world in the Brahmaputra and Ganges delta, right? The entire country of Bangladesh exists because of the sediments coming out from the Himalayas. Same with a lot of the plains of Pakistan. They exist because of the sediments coming out of the Western Himalayas and our northern plains also. And so climate is important, and vegetation. So more vegetation, ergo less sediments coming out, because vegetation will trap the rainfall, vegetation will stop, will provide protection to the underlying rocks, and so this. So just to tell, go back to what I was saying, more slope, higher the gradient of a landscape, more erosion. And this is what I wanted to say, precipitation. The more rainfall, you have a sharp increase in erosion with rainfall, but then once rain goes beyond a certain limit, there's a lot of vegetation that comes up because of the extra water. And so once you have extra vegetation, it's a classic feedback effect, less erosion, right? So where do we have maximum erosion? We are likely to have maximum erosion in the semi-arid areas, in the wet but not very wet areas. And in our country, that's basically the Shivaliks. That is a lot of the region where we generate our sediments from the Himalayas. But if you look at the peninsular India, And often when we think of rivers and sediments, we are too quick to focus on the Himalayas. There's a whole different story going on in central India. So the central parts of Madhya Pradesh, eastern Rajasthan, if you think of the Chambal ravines, if you think of the gullies that are there, that is huge sediment generation. Why? Because there is just enough sediment to cut down into the soil, but or rather there is just enough rainfall to cut down into the soil, but not enough rainfall to cover it in thick forests. Right. So that's why central India, parts of Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, they have some very, very high loss of soil. And that remarkably affects livelihoods, that affects agriculture, that muddies up rivers and affects riverine habitats, and that causes the whole thing going ahead. And so basically in geography, we talk about sediment generation zone, sediment transportation, and sediment deposition zone. Depositions are what we call sedimentary sinks. These are your floodplains, your fans, your deltas. And transport is where the sediment comes across, and erosion is where it's coming out from. So finally, I'll just take a minute more. This is what we mean by sediment budgets. And this was a study that was done, which shows how much sediment is coming out from the Himalayas, which part of the Himalayas. And these lines are basically joining which river is bringing how many metric tons of sediment per year, right? And so the Ganga, and then how much of the sediment is going into the floodplains, how much of the sediment or water or sediment is coming out through the Hooghly, how much is going into the Bengal Delta. And this sediment does not stop at the Bengal Delta. It continues beyond, because we have the submarine Bengal Sea fan, and these sediments are deposited all the way below the Bay of Bengal, all up right up to Sri Lanka. So it's a huge deposit that has been growing on for millions of years. And so these are the places from the Himalayas where we get the most erosion. And so, June and July is coming. Pretty soon you will get reports of flash floods in the Himalayas. You will get reports of landslides in the Himalayas, where you will never have these reports from the high Himalayas. You will always have them from the Shivaliks. You will have them from the lesser Himalayas. Why? Because Shivaliks are made up of sedimentary rocks. They break up much more easily. The lesser Himalayas, that is the Dhauladhars, the Pir Panjals, these are made up of rocks like slate and schist. These have cracks in them. To use a very simple terminology, foliations or cracks. And so that allows them to weather, break apart far more easily. And so you have movement. Same thing in Darjeeling, right? Because of the cracks and the fractures that are present over there, right? And so this is again from the Himalayas, what amount of soil loss is happening. And as you can see, the highest rates that we have are from landslides. So, another paradox, we think that Himalayas se to sab sediment nadiyan la rahi hai. Nahin, maximum sediment supply from the Himalayas are due to landslides. Okay, that's one thing which we often look over. And the other thing that you will see is wherever human beings are, sediment generation is far more higher. So if people are there, we enable more generation of sediments. Of course, we do construction, we do terracing and cultivation that generates sediments. Remarkably, in parts of the Himalayas, a lot of erosion happened after the British occupied it and decided, okay, we want pretty golf courses. So they took off the vegetation and they said, we want an 18-hole golf course. And of course, the golf course, short grass, more erosion, right? So, these things are feedbacks. And all the sediment that comes out, this is how it comes and deposits in the delta, builds up the delta. So the southern part of our delta it's around 7,000 years old, and it has grown in different phases. So this is what we call the sink, or the sediment sink. And as the sediment comes out, it has grown in different phases. And the rivers in the Bengal Delta, they have gradually been shifting towards east. That is, they've been going towards Bangladesh. And earlier, it is said that the Hooghly itself along Calcutta was the main stream through which the Ganga used to flow. Then it got disconnected, presumably due to a number of earthquakes that happened in northern Bengal and Assam. And once the Hooghly got disconnected, 200 years later, we were forced to build Farakka to keep Calcutta alive, right? So, sediments, river changes can be dramatic, and their effects can be felt across centuries, right? That's the point I want to get across here. And these sediments are building up now. So because the Ganga has shifted to the east, all the main amount of sediment is going to Bangladesh. Their riverine islands, their Sundarban islands are actually growing in size, studies have shown, whereas ours are shrinking. And because we don't have that amount of sediment supply, and because our Sundarban islands are largely shrinking, facing erosion, we have people migrating out of the Sundarbans. We face the specter of climate change and possible sea level rise here. And that makes it even more hazardous prone, because if there is no sediment coming in from upstream, not replenishing the delta, then obviously you're not going to have stable places. And it's not just us. We see this throughout the world. For example, in Egypt, they built the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, and they stopped the flow of the Nile a bit and to irrigate the delta, but the delta reduced in size because less sediments went to the delta, right? We see the same thing in China after the construction of the three gorges. Lesser amount of sediment supply has gone towards the estuary, and that not only affects the size of the estuary or the delta, these sediments carry nutrients. These sediments are very rich in nutrients. So the amount of fish catch has declined in the Yangtze because less fishes are getting nutrients, so they are growing less, right? So sediments can have a far-reaching impact. These are maps that are available of how much erosion takes place from where. If you just focus on India over here, red bits means very high erosion. So our northern plains face a lot of erosion. China has some of the most eroded landscapes, of course, but our northern plains face a lot of high erosion, and that's a cause for worry. And then if you see in terms of rivers, the Brahmaputra, Ganga, Brahmaputra together, they carry some of the largest sediment loads in the world. As I said, the biggest monsoon, highest mountains, erodible rocks, that is the cue for large sediment generation. But nowhere else in the world do so many people, so many millions of people depend on these sediments. That's what makes managing them, studying them so very crucial, right? And so another technical term we use is sediment yield. So that's basically how much sediment is coming out of a basin, how much sediment is being generated and coming out of a river basin. These are things that we measure, and we affect this sediment. If you build a dam, like I said, we stop a lot of the sediment, and that does not end up going down to the river, and that causes changes in landscapes. And then see, this is how the river changes. These are two photos of the same river at low flows, at high flows. Just the amount of sediment causes a lot of change in the river character. Similarly, this is the Elva Dam, which was in the US. They have now removed this because they decided that stopping all those sediments behind the dam is not fruitful enough. So one of the largest cases of river restoration or dam decommissioning that happened in the US was the removal of this dam to allow free flow of sediments. And sediments come in various sizes. If you see the pictures below, very fine sediments, they come out as a tongue into a body of water, or you even have very coarse sediments, gravels and cobbles, which stack up like shelves, like a bookshelf, right? And that happens as well, right?
Right.
Uh,
So
yeah,
I just wanted to sort of get a sense on, I've heard so many wonderful things. I'm just like my brain is on a little bit of a overdrive listening to so many wonderful facts. But we've constantly heard the word sediments, and you just mentioned that there is this fine sediment and there is this big gravel and rock also, which we call sediment. So can you touch upon the variance in sediment, like, or does all sediment look similar? And related to that, I think somewhere I had read about the um, I've always heard about carbon-based dating, or time, like the half time that many elements have. But I think in somewhere I'd also read about sediment-based dating. And if you can touch upon these points on in this conversation, that would be also great.
sure. Thank you for bringing me back to that. So I'll just go ahead with this. So yeah, rivers do get affected by sediments. As you said, there are sediments of different types. And that's why now we have, we look at rivers, looking at how geology, hydrology, and biology affects them. And so no river looks the same throughout its reach, right? So it keeps changing. And that's primarily because of changes in the biology and the sediments that are there. So for example, in the Amazon, we see very fine sediments come in. In the Amazon, we also have a high amount of organic sediments because dense forests, and they basically turn the rivers black. So for example, in fact, there is a river called the Rio Negro. So Rio means river and Negro means, dark. So the dark colored river that is there. Why? Because of the huge amount of organic sediments that come in. And then as you said, there are different types of sediments. So fishes, these sediments provide habitats. And, we hear about rivers affecting fishes, rivers affecting wildlife. Wildlife affects rivers also. So we had this nice study from the US, which showed that when salmon go upstream, it's just like our hills are, when salmon go upstream, they spawn. And when they wish to spawn, with their tails, they make a small hole on the riverbed, and then they lay their eggs. Now, if thousands of salmon are going up a river and, spawning, and disturbing the sediments on the river bed, those rivers are actually cutting down faster. They are eroding faster. And so, fish is causing a river to move. So, those are some pretty fantastic studies that we get. Human beings affect sediments, as I was saying. We dredge. This is just beside Calcutta. We have brought up sediments, and coming to the point that you were saying, different kinds of sediments are there in a system, and they move at different velocities. So, just like you can pick up a light suitcase and move quickly, but a heavy suitcase needs more power. So for a river, it's the same. Okay. So, we use a curve basically to see what kind of velocity transports what amount of sediments, what load of sediments. We use these curves. And that brings us to something quite interesting, which we call GST. And now we hear GST within goods and services tax, right? So that's the bane of everyone. But in when we talk about rivers, GST means gravel sand transition. So it's when we go from upstream to downstream of a river, where the size of the sediment changes. It goes from larger boulders and cobbles and pebbles and gravels to finer sands. We go downstream, it becomes silt and clay, right? So this GST is very important. Why? Because this is where we see a complete change in the river character. Think of the Ganga just at Rishikesh or Devaprayag, then Haridwar, and further downstream, Bijnor, I think, or the Tista, which is just above Shevok, and then the Tista coming downstream. Whenever a river crosses its mountain front, there is a drop in the velocity of the river because it loses that slope, that steep slope. Because the river's velocity drops, what happens is the larger bits it is carrying, it dumps those larger bits first. Because let's dump the harder bits, let's dump the bigger bits first, right? So that's what it does. So all along the foothills, we have a zone, which is the coarser material zone. And that has often been referred to as the bhabar, which is where the rivers are said to disappear because the water percolates down through these stones, down through these gravels. And then the rivers are said to re-emerge in the Terai, which was the marshy zone. The Terai was the infamous part where, the area of malaria, the area of, in British India, the area of malaria, dacoits and everything. People would be afraid to go. So the Bhabar and the Terai, technically that is what we would call the gravel and sand transition zone, where the river comes in, and then the river flows out, and then there's a change in the bed material that is there. So that is what this diagram is showing over here, right? Where we have more coarse material, and then we have more fine material. That is what it changes. And then coming to what you were saying about finding these sediments. So this GST, it changes over time. And the changes in time, even the GST, are actually linked to climate cycles as well. Why? Because, say, for example, if I have a stronger monsoon, and then much more water being dumped on the mountains, much larger rivers, more power in the water, that is going to bring the larger materials further down. And so the GST, so the gravel zone is going to be much larger. But if I have a weaker monsoon, less rain, less power in the river, then lesser amount of gravel is going to come down. And so more sand in the river, right? So sand zone is likely going to be larger. So, when we look at river histories, and we look at the sediments that are dumped across the floodplain, we can see how much coarse material, how much fine material, and then we take a little sample of them. And taking the sample is indeed very interesting because it has to be done in a completely dark environment. We use a pipe, we just hammer it into the sediment, and then we take that pipe, we go to a dark lab where there is nothing but a dim red light, and then we excite that sediment with fresh pulse of energy, and from that we kind of get how old was the sediment, when did that last sediment see daylight. So this is what is called OSL, optical spectral luminescence dating, and this is a technique that we use to find out how old are the sediments in a river. Okay, how old are the sediments along the floodplain of a river. And because, see, rivers build up on themselves. You have a river flowing today, it dumps a lot of sediment, the floodplain goes up. Or you have a river flowing, there's a lot of water coming in, or there is an uplift in the area, the river cuts down, and you have a river terrace on top. So when did a river cut down? When did a river build up its floodplain? At what rate did it do? Did it have any link with the monsoon cycles? So all of this comes from the age of the sediments. Because once we have a column of sediment, we get a date from the upper part of the column, from the lower part of the column. So in between is the rate, means the difference of age, and the thickness of the sediments gives us the rate. So this much amount of material was deposited over this much amount of time, right?
Right.
So this is the dating part, right?
Wow. No, that's fascinating. It just gives a fresh perspective on how physical attributes are helping us decode what's happened over time and what are the factors we're using. So there is so much movement of sediment of different sizes. Uh, of course, you hinted a little bit on the interaction with fishes a little while ago, but can you highlight a little bit for us on how this then creates various kinds of riverscapes and the ecological corridors also that possibly sediment deposition and transportation is creating?
All right. Thank you. So the next perspective that we will bring in is what is called river corridors. And that again is a term that has come up very recently, I would say, last 20 years. Often when people would talk about a river, it's just the river, right? But what we now talk about is space for the river. And that becomes very important. We come across terms like floodplain zonation, space for the river, freedom of movement for the river. And all of it comes down to what is called the river corridor. So river corridor is nothing much but the space on either side of the river or the floodplain within which the river can move freely, within which the river has historically moved freely. So, and demarcating this is also pretty simple. If you have old maps, if you have old satellite images, basically we look at what are the maximum extent of the meanders, what are till where are the oxbow lakes found, till where are the meander swales or the meander scars found. That means the river was there at one point of a time. And if it is let go, then it can ideally move through that space again. Now, ideally, this is the part of the river that we should not touch. This is the part of the river that we should let be. But because of our population pressures, we do end up building on the floodplain. We do end up living right within the river corridor, and that creates a problem, right? So typically a river corridor or a river, this zone would be this light green part, right? And the deep green part is the older part of the floodplain, and this light green part is where the river is active, where it moves around. And there is good reason to leave it like that, because whatever damage a river needs to do, damage in terms of, let's say, floods, though I would not classify floods as damaging, I would say floods are very beneficial for the ecosystem. But if a river needs to flood, it will flood within this space, right? It will happen within this space. So if we now want to start living within that space, then we have to deal with the risks that come from living within that space, right? And just very quickly to give you a background of how this has happened, rivers have usually been considered just as water, then water and sediment. But now today we have, after the 1990s, something came out called the European Water Framework Directive. This is in the mid 1990s over here, EUWFD. And these were basically a set of guidelines which were legally binding for all the EU member nations, which said that you must take better care of your surface water bodies. That means rivers, wetlands, ponds, your entire freshwater ecosystem, lentic and lotic, you must take better care of these ecosystems. And so what evolved from those were a series of schemes or frameworks called hydromorphological frameworks. That means hydro for the water, morpho for the sediment and landform. So the first time we are not talking about hydrology, we are talking about hydromorphology, right? And today we talk about eco-hydromorphology because we realize plants are equally important. Plants control how waters flow, animals are important, they control how rivers move, right? And vice versa. So after the EUWFD, there has been a lot of frameworks, and this idea of river corridor, river restoration, river rehabilitation. We'll talk about nature-based solutions maybe. So, those aspects have come up in a far bigger light. India does not have any hydromorphological frameworks. Till date, whatever studies have happened in the country, they are basically importing the European frameworks or the American frameworks. We're importing. We do have a set of guidelines for India too. But then for us, these are guidelines. These are not legally binding. And because these are not legally binding, there is no enforcement to, actually carry out through with them. So yeah, this is about, and the other main thing that has come, main term that has come in terms of what we say this river corridor or riparian corridor is connectivity. We use this term a lot in these days in geography, in my domain, connectivity. So river connectivity. A river has three connections. There is the longitudinal connectivity, means upstream to downstream. See, we define rivers as flowing water. If a river does not flow, we would hardly call it a river, right? So movement is life. Movement is a river, right? So longitudinal connectivity means upstream to downstream movement of the water. Lateral connectivity means the river's connection with its floodplain on either side. As the flood water goes, it recharges the groundwater. nutrients from the floodplain come into the river. They recharge the river system as well. They provide nutrients to the fish. And then there is vertical connectivity, which is river water and groundwater interaction. So in the dry months, it's actually the groundwater infusing into the river that keeps it alive. In the wet season, it is the river water going down into the groundwater that keeps it recharged, right? So these three kinds of connections are very important. And today we try to measure these kind of connections, measure these kind of connectivities, and how they change from the upper part, from a mountain part to a floodplain part to a deltaic part. This becomes very important. And I'll just leave. I'll just stop with this one thing. When we talk of hydrographs, it means if you have seen hydrographs, okay, so much amount of time, so much amount of rainfall or discharge that is happening. Today we view hydrographs a little differently. Why? Because if a water starts to rise in a river, if the water level starts to rise in a river, that is actually connecting the different parts of the river that were dry, and that is allowing seeds to move from upstream to downstream. That is allowing fish to migrate from upstream to downstream or downstream to upstream. So the water or the hydrograph, we can actually break down the hydrograph into different parts, which are when it allows seed dispersal, when it allows fish movement, and as the hydrograph drops, how that affects these things. And that's why, as you are aware, there is a term today we use called e-flows or environmental flows. What is the minimum amount of water that a river should have, at least to sustain its aquatic ecosystem? And there are Supreme Court rulings on this, and a lot of work is going on in that domain, right?
Right. Right. No, thanks for this. I think I know about e-flows and I know about some of this, but to be able to see how there's a whole stepwise, almost gradient into how different water levels in the river or flux in the river is related to various different uh, actions and activities within the natural ecosystem is very fascinating to see. But the thing that we have continuously seen as we work at Veditum and India Sandwatch is the issue of sand mining and the incredible amount of removal of silt and sediment from rivers. So, can you possibly sort of talk to us a little bit about this removal of sediments from rivers? What are possible effects of this kind of removal of sediments, the scale of which is mind-boggling in terms of what we see today. So if you can briefly talk about that over the next few minutes.
Right. Thank you. So coming to the issue of sand mining, as you said, I would still say, thanks to Veditum and India Sand Watch, this is coming out into the public domain. And I will tell you from a scientist's side, very few people are still aware of this. And because the reason is, every time I show them a few images or I refer to them to your website, they're like, oh, wow, this is happening. So, that's a, light bulb moment for them. So sand mining is very important. I still have people who come up and tell me, but doesn't the sand come back? Does it really matter if we take it? And, we are at pains to tell them, see, even if it comes back, there are scars. Even if it comes back, there are things that happen to the river which are not going to have recover very, very quickly at all. And it's fine if you do take sand, but you have to realize how much, where, and how, right? So these are things that are very, very important to look at. So we were doing a small study on sand mining, and so I'll just focus on a little bit of that. So this is the Subarnarekha River, which is kind of a big river in eastern India. It comes out from Jharkhand, goes into the Bay of Bengal. And we looked at some parts of the river over here which had sand mining. And what we discovered is when we looked at, these are Google Earth images, freely available to all, that we see different patterns. We see different landforms that are being produced. And these are not something that a river would produce. These are not something that any natural agent would produce, right? For example, if you see these thin lines, these are the truck paths. These are the paths that trucks have made to go to the middle of the riverbed and go and access the sediment or the sand that is there. Again, similarly over here. And at the end of the day, the river gets hollowed out, the river gets mined out. So these are the hollowed bits that are remaining of the river, right? And basically it gets broken down into a series of pools. And so there is, as I was saying, connectivity. There is loss of upstream to downstream connectivity. A lot of the rivers get dammed by low sand bridges to stop the flow and then mine out the sand from within those pools. And basically, I would say it kind of destroys the river, right? So that is what happens over here. And these are the kind of features that happen. You have huge JCBs on the riverbed piling up the sand, creating large hollows and pools for hundreds of trucks to carry away the sand from. And if you can see this over time, see the same place, we are looking at the same place, how over time from say 2017 to 2021, this entire sandbar that was there, this very thick, very high sandbar that was there, that has got gradually consumed, right? And I would also like to draw your attention to, this where my mouse is, where we have, a lighter color over here. We have a different color over here. These are basically the turbid pools that are there, because as the JCBs with their jaws, they are going down into the riverbed, they are bringing up the sand. That is basically, just mobilizing the sand throughout the river column, throughout the water column. And that makes the water extremely, brownish in color, and that shows up like this. Now, if the water is this turbid, it's a problem. Why? Because turbid water does not allow good sunlight penetration. And if we do not have good sunlight penetration, whatever plants are there on the riverbed, they will do less photosynthesis. There will be less amount of oxygen generated within the water as a result, less dissolved oxygen. And because of the lesser amount of dissolved oxygen, there will be a sharp decline in the aquatic life. So fish will get less oxygen, and it will be a problem for other aquatic species, right? So this is what we see. And what this also does is, once we create these kind of pools on the riverbed, the river changes. It changes course, because now basically it has had somebody dig up its path for it. So at one high flow, one monsoon, it just decides to change its path, right? It just goes the other way. And that creates a problem, because it increases riverbank erosion. Because if you're mining next to the riverbank, you're hollowing out areas along the riverbed next to the riverbank. The river shifts into that direction. So you end up having an unstable riverbank. And we have spoken with farmers who lose land because of this. We have looked at conflicts that happen in this zone between the sand miners and the local people who are doing agriculture. And that creates a whole other socio-economic issue in that particular space, right? So just to come back to this issue of, how does the river change? So we looked at the same river over time, and, these little bits that you can see, this is with the darker bits, these are where the areas are very, very turbid. And you can see the color of water. This is the, pristine river water, very, very less turbidity. And this is the orange water is from where the mining has taken place, where the river has actually turned orange, or these pools have actually turned orange. And this basically creates a huge problem for the fish. What we found is, in this bottom photograph, once these pools dry out, the fish start to die. Or once you've hollowed out the bed of the river, and then the water level starts to drop, these pools become disconnected from the main channel. So they become little ecosystems on their own. Once they dry out, there is a lot of weed growth within them. There is a death of fish that happens within them. So sand mining does have recurring impacts, and this is something that is ongoing, right?
Right. Thanks so much. I also just want to be mindful of time a little bit. So I'll sort of club my last two questions for you together. That we're obviously seeing a lot of negative impacts and effects with the way sediment extraction is happening currently. One part of it is that, is there any way to really restore this degraded sort of riverscape landscape? And if yes, and I know from your work that you've done some nature-based methods to do restoration. So if you can highlight that for us quickly, maybe in a couple of minutes, and then we'll move into the Q&A session where we'll take up questions from the audience first, and then we'll come back to the discussion. Yeah.
Fine, thank you. So yeah, we have done some work regarding river rehabilitation. So this is, we looked at nature-based solutions, that is use of live vegetation to protect river banks. And we did this again in Ghatal, where there is a lot of flood, and river banks are erosion prone. And we worked with the local panchayat there. In fact, they had already done this, and we went and helped with the study, where we looked at vetiver grass. And so the type of grass is very important, because this is a type of grass that grows very quickly. It grows, it has very thick, fibrous roots that can bind the soil. So, these are the grass buffers that were installed along the river bank in this particular location. And this is how the work is done. Basically, what we do is we modify the river bank, we modify the slope, we make some bamboo structures, fill it up with soil, then the grass is planted. Now, it's very crucial that the grass is planted at the right time. You do it in November, The problem that we have faced with these projects is that to sanction the money, sometimes it takes time, and the grass gets planted in March. And so if it has only 1 month to grow or 2 months to grow before the monsoon, it doesn't work, right? But in some cases where the grass was planted in November, it grew up into a very thick system. And of course, it needs to be untampered. So you can't plant the grass and let loose cattle within it. That doesn't work, right? So if the grass remains untampered, what we saw is, one site that we studied, there was a lot of erosion, but it was on that part of the river where there was no grass. But the part of the river that had this grass cover, that had this vertical grass cover, that was very, very well protected. And that in fact trapped more sediments, and the riverbank actually grew in size. So I'll just conclude with one photograph. The right side is where the grass was planted. That is where the village was. And that was entirely protected. And the opposite side, there was no grass cover. So it's supposed to be on the inside bend of a meander. That means it does not have any erosion, but actually did get eroded. Whereas the outside part, which is more erosion prone, that was entirely protected because of this grass cover, right? And this is very cost effective. We did a cost analysis study. If you want to do a earthen embankment or a cement embankment, a 1 kilometer embankment will cost you around 1.6 crores. This 500 meter, this grass embankments just costs you 25 lakhs. So it's like, it's a fraction of the cost. Based on this grass, you can also have self-help groups, particularly for this vetiver grass. It is used for many local industries for, traditional, folk instruments, or rather the handicrafts, these things. And also for in the perfume industry, it is used. It's a essential oil. So, people benefit from that manner also. So this is one NBS, that nature-based solution we were part of, right? Right.
All right. Thanks so much. Maybe we can stop the screen share for now, and we'll take some questions from the audience. We've collected questions from the chat, and I'll just read them out to you one by one, and if you can answer those. So the first is from Sankal, who asks, how do hydropower projects affect sediments and river basins? So quick answers will be great. Yeah.
So large dams definitely affect sediments and river basins. There are a lot of studies on how rivers have changed downstream of dams, and how sediment has changed downstream, how sediment has declined, sediment load has declined. As I gave you two examples of the Aswan Dam and of the Three Gorges Dam, where the deltas have reduced in size, or the estuaries are getting less sediment supply because of the dams. We see the same thing after construction of dams in the Subarnarekha, Godavari, Kaveri, these areas also, where sediment movement downstream has declined because these are basically trapped behind the dam. Also, it does affect areas upstream of the dam also, because it fills up the reservoir, mind. And so basically then either you desilt it, or you have to let the sediment accumulate, and then the capacity of a reservoir goes down. That's what we see in the Damodar. And that's why, even though we have so many dams on the Damodar, we're not really stopping the floods, because the reservoirs are almost at half capacity, right?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. The questions are also coming in order of as we were discussing and people were asking questions. Om Gupta has two questions. I think one you had partially answered, which was around the influence of climate on sediment budgets. And the other, which is a more controversial question for those who know the details, is can he get sedimentation and discharge data for the Bhagirathi River?
So climate does influence sediment. As I said, more rainfall usually translates into more sediment, but beyond a certain limit, the higher rainfall gives more vegetation, so lesser amount of sediment. Regarding discharge data, I would refer you to the India WRIS website. You can get sediment and discharge data for the peninsular rivers of India from there. But no, not for any transboundary international river in India. That is the entire Ganga Brahmaputra in the system is classified data. You can apply to the Central Water Commission through their channels to try and obtain this data. It is very difficult. If you still want yearly data and monthly data or decadal data, it might be all right. But if you want daily data, it is near impossible. Right.
Yeah.
So that's the problem.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing. I think so many of us who try to look at sediment and discharge data to build arguments or understanding have not been able to access this information. Next question is by Arnab Ghosh. Arnab asks, is it ever possible to predict sediment transport?
we can predict sediment transport. There are, this is an addition to the earlier question. You cannot get maybe discharge and sediment data from the CWC, but nowadays there are global gridded sediment data sets or global gridded discharge data sets that maybe it's much more coarser, but at least something is better than nothing. And we have models like SWOT, soil and water analysis tools. We have HECRAS, HECRAS, HECHMS. These are basically software tools which simulate sediment movements. If you have some sediment data of a region, and you can simulate how that will go over the next decade or so, over the next 2 decades or so. So these kind of studies are there.
Okay, okay. Thanks. There seems to be some possibility that is emerging, especially with the availability of technology. And maybe at the end, we can also probably highlight the work we are also doing with machine learning to identify sand mining. Um, there's a question from Tehseen who asks, can sediment dredging upstream restore reservoir balance around the reservoir walls in those susceptible sites where the downstream regions suffer majorly?
Well, sediment dredging upstream is very expensive. And even India spends crores of rupees every year trying to keep the national waterway #1 open. That is basically Ganga Sagar to Allahabad, just trying to keep it open for the vessels. But then once you get that sediment, where do you dump it? So on whose land do you dump it? How far do you take it? I think there has been a recent program, or at least a plan or proposed by the government of Bengal, that they will dredge up this sediment and then sell them to bricklins, or to utilize it in that manner. But again, sediment dredging upstream reservoir, it has not really been done at large scale throughout the country. That's why our dams have lesser and lesser shelf lives. So this is something to be looked at if it has been done.
Right. Oh, actually, you touched upon one of the next questions that are there, and one of the questions that I had from earlier, where Om is asking that is suggesting that channel sedimentation is one of the bigger problems of Bengal's rivers. And he says, is it not possible to make sand industry through dredging of the channel? It might also help to recover the condition of the river. And it sort of speaks to what the recent announcement by the government of West Bengal was. And my first reaction to it was the fact that there is absolutely no mention of ecology, and sediment is whatever purpose sediment plays in recharge of groundwater ecology is completely missing. So then I'll plug in my other question in regards to the presence of sediments in government policy at all. So maybe you can maybe take those two together.
So from commodifying water, now we are commodifying sediment. Sand was the first part. Now dredging it is the next part, right? And as regards sediment management in the country, I think for very long, my knowledge on this is limited, but I think for very long, even the Central Water Commission and its documents did not have much details on sediment management. Only I think after the 2010, there has been some discussion on this. After sand mining has come up in a big way, there have been DSRs, that is district survey reports and other documents which talk about sand mining. And I think your website hosts a lot of DSRs, so people can look through them. Uh, Sedimentation is a big problem in the Bengal rivers. That's because we are getting lesser and lesser amount of flow from the main Ganga. We have basically artificially resuscitated the Hooghly and we are keeping it alive. If you look at the other rivers on the eastern side of the Hooghly, like the Jalangi, the Bhairab, these are all basically the Ichhamuti, these are all basically silted up rivers because they are beheaded from the main Ganga channel, right? And so we have basically kept the Hooghly alive by flushing water into it from Farakka. Otherwise, the Hooghly would also silt up also, right? I'll just add one point in this regard. Many studies have shown that the inflow of tide through the Hooghly estuary happens at a faster rate than the outflow of the water. So the idea is that water is coming in it faster, bringing more sediment, but the outflow is lesser. So lesser sediment is going out. So over time, it's a net deposit within the estuary, right? So that is what is thought to happen, right? Okay.
Okay, okay. Trishal actually is asking about the maps that you'd shown with the various turbidity data, and is asking whether is this a Google Earth Engine script and is it open source? If yes, can a link be shared? Or if not, is there a publication that they can access to understand this better?
So this is a Google Earth Engine script. One of my students developed it for his ongoing work. So we are in the process of publishing this, fingers crossed. It gets published. So we will have the script and all online at that point. So Let's pray that that happens soon.
Wonderful. So what we'll do is we'll keep in touch with you about this, and once it's published, we'll send it to all the people who've registered for today's session, including Trishul. Yeah. We're almost at time. Maybe we'll take 5 minutes to wrap up two, three more questions also because we started about 5 minutes late.
Sure.
Shubhajyoti has a series of questions. I'll try to sort of uh, get something out of it. There's a lot of text, but okay. So the first question is more like a comment, which says whether any policy changes are taking place around the fact that even after having dams like Farakas, the deltas are growing. And because number of people depend on these sediments, what is the policy angle, or is there any policy around people's interdependency with sediments? But there seems to be the suggestion that even with Faraka, the delta is growing. Maybe you can address that point because you highlighted it during your session.
Right. So our delta actually is growing. The Bengal delta is actually growing, yes, but that's on the Bangladesh side. They have net gain. The islands on the Bengal side, West Bengal side, they actually show net loss over the last 100-year period. Because we are having lesser and lesser sediments go down through the estuary. As I said, these are beheaded rivers in a sense. If you want to read how dams and sediments are being affected, then maybe I can refer you quickly to the World Commission on Dam reports that are there, WCD reports. You can also look at reports that have been brought out by Sundar, this is an organization that works exclusively with dams and people. So you can look at that. And well, deltas can grow if see, one reason why we are still getting some sediments into the Hooghly is because of the western rivers of Bengal, the Ajay, the Mayurakhi, the Damodar, the Rupnarayan. These are basically bringing sediments from Choto Nagpur. So that component is still coming in and supplying the riverine islands here, not the Hooghly as much.
Right. So
If I may just interject a bit, is it okay?
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
yeah. So I was trying to highlight on that part of the Bangladesh side of delta is increasing, whereas the Bengal part of delta is not increasing by that much. And as you said, it's a net loss as we have seen over the years. So what I was trying to understand, since a lot of people depend on these alluviums and floodplains also form a major part of the livelihood over here, agriculture. So from that point, is there any kind of studies that are going on to uh, keep the delta alive and sort of facilitate the agriculture better or alternative livelihoods? So from that point of view, my question.
All right. So there are a lot of work going on to look at how the Sundarbans can be made more resilient, not just through upstream sediment supply domains, but also from the prospect of sea level rise. And a lot of World Bank projects have been executed over there in terms of you know uh, lessening the salinity of the land, keeping freshwater lenses alive, right? Because it's strange, but the most important, the most scarce resource in the Sundarbans is actually fresh water, right? During a storm, the what people actually want over there is fresh water, because that declines markedly. So there are a lot of studies, there are a lot of reports, scientific papers also on the delta decline, people being made to shift out of the place, resilience in the delta. So maybe you can look that up.
right. Thanks so much. One last question before we sort of move to the closure is Ayush asks whether it's possible to identify safe zones for river sand mining.
We can, ideally we can. This is what is based on the extraction versus replenishment idea, that how much extraction is happening from a certain area, and then you continuously monitor that. And one good way of doing it is through repeated drone and bathymetry surveys. So you constantly study the volume, so how much volume has been taken. And this is also a good way to find out that whether sand mining is taking from just within the area that was leased out, because these are plots that are leased out, and then or whether it is going into beyond that, into the more illegal paths, and how much is the depth of the sand that is being removed. As there are stated policy guidelines of how much buffer or how much space to leave from the bank, from the edge of the bar, to what depth of mining can sand take place. All these are delineated. The problem is implementing them. So everything is there on paper, right? As Siddharth knows, everything is there on paper, multiple DSR reports, multiple guidelines. Implementing them, tracking them, and then bringing them to the light. That's what I think India Sandwatch does, and that is very important, right?
Thanks so much. I just quickly add on the DSR bit that the team has actually put together a way to assess the availability of district survey reports and in each state. And in the coming weeks, we'll actually be releasing the tool where anybody can assess their own states for the quality of the DSRs that have been put out at a basic level. And then we'll in the future release a more detailed toolkit on how to assess the quality of the DSR uh, page by page. And we're excited that this possibility is becoming real. Um, but with that, I think I really want to thank you for uh, taking us through the journey of sediments today. It's not easy, obviously, to translate heavy scientific topics into an easily understandable version. So, really appreciate your effort in that.
I
Thank
hope it was, I hope it was understandable. That's all.
I feel the questions speak for themselves in terms of how many people have engaged and how many questions they've asked. So what we'll do is we'll then close out today's session. We'll take some recommendations for readings from you and pass it on to all the participants who have joined us today. If with your permission, we may also want to share your email address in case
Yeah,
we
sure.
reach out to you. So we'll do that. A request to everybody who's joined us today is to check out the India Sandwatch platform that Dr. Priyank has also mentioned a few times, which is the platform at the heart of the India Sandwatch project on environmental accountability. Also, please follow us on social media at Veditum and India Sandwatch. My colleagues will put the links and the details in the chat. We'll also email you with these details. And we'd love to have you on this journey with us because the journey of sediments is for us, it's just starting. It's just barely touching the surface of it at the moment. But we want to make this information accessible and available to more people and looking forward to having all of you in future sessions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today.